Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Fortified, Quaking, I guess Quaking is level 7, so Sanguine is the level 4 affix, and then of course Prideful at level 10 like always this season. This week is one that people consider a push week, which means it's a week that you're going to see people doing high keys, trying to push higher score than they have before, the people that are pushing, the 18s, the 19s, the 20s, even above that potentially this week. Should all be something that's possible because neither Sanguine nor Quaking need to cost you any time, right? If you do a little bit of movement for Sanguine, which really doesn't cost you any DPS, the affix can theoretically hurt you not at all, right? It can do no damage or healing. And similarly, Quaking, the spellcast interrupt is a little bit annoying, but as long as you can spread, then you can avoid it slowing you down at all as well, which makes this week really good for any team that is coordinated and is able to handle the affixes, because unlike most weeks, if you actually handle the affixes well this week, they cost you basically 0 time. It's also a fortified week instead of a tyrannical week, which is also really good for high keys. Now, all that being said, that might not affect you or your weekly 15, right? Your weekly 15 key is going to be less about, what is the top end potential if we play as good as possible, how much time can we avoid losing to these affixes, right? Instead, it's going to be a question of just like, how good are we at dealing with Sanguine? How good are we at dealing with Quaking? And those are difficult affixes this expansion. There are a lot of dungeons with narrow corridors. Narrow corridors make it harder to spread for Quaking, especially when there's Sanguine out, right? When there's Sanguine out, that restricts your play area even further. So it's a big challenge. One of the biggest things you can do this week is pull groups back towards areas that you've previously cleared that are wider open, and then you will have more space to spread for Sanguine out there. You'll be dropping your Sanguine puddles behind you, and then you can keep moving throughout the dungeon. This expansion, Sanguine has been nerfed a little bit compared to last expansion. It'll disappear after 20 seconds instead of 60, so it's a little bit less of a disaster if some rooted enemy gets bathing in Sanguine, but it's really something you're going to want to try to avoid if possible, so still make sure that you're thinking about the affix. This week also, routes are back. Routes are back for me. MDT has been, all that whole situation that we talked about last week, if you didn't hear about it, there was various drama controversies, basically all resolved. Everything is happy times in the kingdom once again. MDT, it's safe to update, and in fact you should update it because there have been a lot of fixes to mob count stuff. All the affixes are now in here and everything. Also, this week, I'm offering 2 routes for each dungeon. So I'm doing a route without skips and a route with skips for every single dungeon. The trade-off here, there's basically 3 things you can optimize for in a route, right? There's all right, how simple is this to do, / how few pieces of utility do you need in order to actually make these pulls happen? A route that makes you do a lot of complicated skips or walk past enemies that are technically skippable but hard will do badly on this metric. Then there's a question of how easy is this route? How many times are we combining pulls in a way that's difficult, right? Versus how much are we just fighting one pack at a time? And then there's the question of how fast is this path, right? How much is this going to be able to time a key? How good is this on the timer? And there's really no way to optimize all 3 of those at the same time, right? You're always going to be picking 1 or maybe 2 of those characteristics to min-max, and you are giving up on the third, right? And so these 2 different routes, kind of the no skips one, trying to make sure that we're really not doing anything that will be difficult to explain to a pug. We're never going to try and require everybody to have invis pots. We're just going to go through the dungeon, and the pulls are maybe going to be slightly worse on both of the other metrics in order to make sure that it's a little bit simpler, right? And it's a little bit easier to get through the dungeon. But it's going to be both slower and potentially harder. I've tried to avoid having hard pulls, and I've tried to err on the side of going slower rather than more difficult with the pulls. But again, there's 3 different metrics in the routes. So pick which one you think is best for you if you're interested in taking my routes. They're on Raider.io every week, the Raider.io weekly route, which I create. There will be a link in the description below. One final plug before we get to talking about the dungeons. The Raider.io team, we're running a team competition this week with a bunch of prizes, bunch of game time, store mounts, store pets, that kind of stuff. You can read all about it. There's a link near the top of my weekly route article. I guess I'll probably have a link. I'll put a link to that competition in the description below as well. But basically, you can just register your team, and then any runs you do this week, even if you're only doing 14s or 9s or whatever, there's different brackets for different key levels. And if you do some good keys relative to other people doing the same level keys as you that are registered for the tournament, or for the competition thing. You get some cool prizes. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's go dungeon by dungeon. So first off, we've got The Other Side. The Other Side has a couple of narrow corridors that are actually quite annoying with Sanguine and Quaking, which we haven't had to deal with these affixes yet in here, but particularly in the Mechagon area, there's a lot of space in here that is not great to have those affixes active in, so watch out for that. Other than that, this is a dungeon that I think it's a fairly hard dungeon just as a baseline relative to the other ones, but I think that this is a fairly good week for it. I think that relative to most weeks, this is one of the better The Other Side weeks. Halls of Atonement, by contrast, so this is one of the easier dungeons just kind of by default. Quaking is actually kind of annoying on a couple different boss fights here. So you have the first boss. Space can sometimes be an issue here, particularly if you get like a Quake overlap when you're low on space or when you're trying to do the Refracted Sunlight. That can actually be a situation where it's hard to avoid cleaving people. As long as you move the boss aggressively, if you've cleared out the trash near it, shouldn't be too much of a problem. Echelon, also, you can get some really nasty Quake overlaps here with the the stun if you're not prepared, so make sure that you are prepared for that. And then the rest of it, also, it's not too bad here. This boss, the Quakes, are pretty easy to manage. Last boss as well. It shouldn't be too difficult. There are some heavy healing intensive parts in those where if your healer gets locked, it can be bad, but other than that, not too much to worry about. Another dungeon this is a dungeon that's just good on most weeks, and this week, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the best week on the calendar for it. That would probably go to something like Bursting Volcanic, but it's a good week for sure. Mists of Tirna Scithe, this one is obviously also one of the easier dungeons, just kind of on a standard week. I would say this week is kind of no different. Quaking, you actually have quite a lot of space in the maze, so Quaking and Sanguine are both non-issues basically in this area. In this starting area, also not too bad. And then, Quaking, it can be a little bit rough on some of these pulls, but really for the most part, you can kind of safely ignore most of these affixes in here, and that is pretty nice. So, yeah, Mist, a great dungeon and a great week for this dungeon also. Plaguefall. Okay, so Plaguefall, at least it's not tyrannical. Tyrannical Plaguefall, I think, is quickly becoming one of the banes of, like, the plus 14, plus 15 weekly keys that I've been both doing and watching. This has been a dungeon where just on Tyrannical, every boss can potentially be can just, really murder you, and you don't have lusts and prides for all of them. On Fortified, obviously, it's a little bit less of a problem. Sanguine and Quaking are somewhat annoying in here. This is a pretty technically intensive dungeon, especially if you're trying to make a lot of use, like my Skips route does, of the different barrels and the different plague borers here. If you're trying to kill a lot of stuff with that, you can very easily get in a situation where there's a lot of Sanguine healing going on. So that's something to watch out for. But, no matter how that should be pretty localized to this one stretch of the dungeon. And the rest of the dungeon should be fairly free. Obviously, Quaking poses a slight challenge with the solitary prey mechanic on this boss, but you just have to not panic. You have to spend 6 seconds isolated before this thing webs you, so you have plenty of time there. And then last boss fight can also be annoying. With the Quakes, especially in the last phase when you have all the ads and everybody's running from tentacles. If you also get a bad Quake overlap there, can be rough, but not too bad. Again, Fortified instead of Tyrannical. Sanguine Depths. Now this is a dungeon where Sanguine and Quaking are very, very, very toxic. Not only are the corridors just narrow all the way through, you also just have all these spots where, like, you're killing trash in what will become your boss room, right? You kill this trash, and that's kind of where you wanted to be able to drag the boss to, right? You kill this trash, and that's kind of some of the area you might want to drag the boss to, right? So be cognizant of that. At least it disappears after 20 seconds now, so it's a lot nicer than it would have been had the BFA 60-second rule been in place. But you still really don't want to heal this thing for 10% of its health on the opener. This boss is such a tricky one. And then the rest of the dungeon, again, it's not too bad. This part, you have the Quaking overlap with General Call's, volley thing that you need to stack for, so that's a little bit not nice. That particular overlap, if it just happens at the wrong time. You can spread within the circle, or maybe you try and stack 2 people directly on top of each other, but in practice, if there's a lot going on, I would expect that to just be a big problem for a lot of groups, so, good luck. Spires of Ascension, this dungeon is a dungeon I would describe as one of the harder ones, just on average, because there's a lot of pulls that are tough in here. I wouldn't describe it as a particularly bad Sanguine or Quaking dungeon, though, at least by my estimations here before actually playing the week. Some of these pulls are going to have Sanguine dropping as you kill. A lot of pulls in this dungeon, you kill something first, right? And then the rest of the stuff dies later. You know, you have these squad leaders that you're focusing down or whatever. And that, you do need to watch out for where your Sanguine's going there. You do need to watch out, especially if you're playing in a group without any displacement effects, without any Typhoons or Death Grips or whatever. You want to watch out for these mobs that are rooted most of the time, you know, getting themselves charging into some Sanguine and then staying there. Worst case, if that happens, you can usually just have the whole group run and it'll move the mob, but often by the time that happens, the damage is already done, so yeah, that's rough. Especially, you know, Goliaths as well. It's sort of similar to Motherlode, if you remember in the Motherlode where there were those Peacekeepers that would stand still and cast for like 10 seconds in a row. Goliaths are absolutely like that. You know, they can do recharge into a Rebellious Fist. At least you can kick the Rebellious Fist, but the recharge can be, they just sit and cast for several seconds. So make sure that there isn't Sanguine under these things when that's happening. It's nowhere near as bad as Motherlode, but there are some packs that are going to be somewhat reminiscent of that. So just keep those skills that you learn from dealing with Sanguine in the Motherlode in mind. Necrotic Wake. Okay, so this dungeon isn't a horrific Quaking or Sanguine dungeon, but it's a dungeon that's already fairly annoying. There's already all these mobs that kind of like run around and jump around. So you need to be thinking ahead with where you're dropping your Sanguine, with where you're dropping your, or with where you're positioning yourself to fight bosses, right? So you don't have too much of a Quaking issue. This boss, you know, using this area of the room is a really nice one because there's not patrols and there shouldn't be too much Sanguine over there. Just make sure that you're pulling everything that you can back a little bit, drop the Sanguine behind where you want to be, and then keep moving forward through the dungeon. This boss room, obviously completely unaffected by Sanguine and Quaking, so that one's nice. This boss room, again, you're bailed out a little bit by the fact that the Sanguine goes away after 20 seconds, but just make sure that you're not killing the last pack right below where, like right in the middle of the room. Try and keep that Sanguine off to the sides. And then Quaking on this last boss, you're already sort of incentivized, if you're doing this boss correctly, to be spread around the room so that whoever gets targeted by the frozen binds can quickly get dispelled or shapeshift or whatever without affecting other players, but be extra careful of that. Especially if you're playing with like a rat group and this fight goes long and then you start getting just your whole platform covered with ice. That's when the Quaking could start to maybe pose a challenge. Oh, hey, one thing, Spires of Ascension Part 2. On beta, at least, Quaking would kill you if a Quake spawned and you'd all like clicked on the angels at the same time and you were stacked on top of each other. So, I don't know, we'll learn fairly quick if that's still happening in live, but if it is, that's gonna suck. Alright, last dungeon, Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain does have some narrow corridors, right? This is a dungeon with some tight areas that you're operating in. Quaking in pretty much every single wing of this dungeon can be an issue. Sanguine, less so. It's less often the kind of thing where you actually need the space that you just drop the blood in, although you do want to be careful here. One thing that'll happen with these like jumping mobs is that your ranged DPS will just stay back, 30 yards away from the pack and keep doing damage. And if it turns out that there's Sanguine between you and them and the mobs like leap into it, or leap over it and then run back into it and then start casting, that can start to be really bad. So the way that you should attack this room, really always for DPS optimization, but particularly when you're trying to manage Sanguine, is make sure that your range just stay right on top of your melee and you just have a nice tight stack. And that way all these mobs that have mechanics where they jump on somebody random won't be jumping out of the AoE, but will just stay right where they are. Anyways, that is the dungeons this week. That's all 8 of them. It's nice there's only 8 this week for this video instead of 10 or 12 like there were last expansion. Hope they don't add any new dungeons. Hope you liked this video. Hope it helped. Let me know in the comments if there's anything I got blatantly wrong. Check out the Rare.io article and the team competition stuff. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/ratnose. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.